This move immediately stakes a claim in the center of the board, opening diagonals for both the queen and the king's bishop, and preparing for rapid development of pieces. This move, nf6, is a very common and flexible response to 1d4, immediately developing a piece and controlling important central squares, often leading to systems like the Indian defenses. This move prepares to establish central pawn control and challenges black's knight, aiming for a flexible setup that can lead to various well-known opening structures like the queen's gambit or English opening depending on black's response. This move transitions into a queen's Indian defense or Nimzo Indian defense territory, preparing to develop the kingside bishop and solidify central control. This move develops a knight to its most natural square, preparing for kingside castling and maintaining flexibility for white's pawn structure. This move establishes a solid queen's pawn game structure, aiming to control central space and prepare for potential pawn breaks later in the game. This move develops a knight to its most active square, reinforcing the central pawn on d4 and preparing to castle, while also allowing for further pawn expansion with e4. By capturing the c4 pawn, black enters the queen's gambit accepted, strategically accepting white's gambit pawn with the intent to either hold onto it temporarily or to provoke white into developing their pieces to recapture it. This move, e3, is a standard way to address black's capture on c4, aiming to recapture the pawn with the bishop on f1 and develop it to a natural square, thereby continuing white's central pawn development and preparing for king's side castling. This move initiates a queen's Indian defense setup where black challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to liberate their queenside pawns and potentially create an isolated pawn for white. This move recaptures the pawn, developing the bishop to an active central square and continuing white's development in the queen's gambit declined main line. This move prepares to expand on the queenside with the b5 pawn push, aiming to gain space and potentially challenge white's central control. This move strategically accepts the pawn sacrifice, opening lines for development and potentially leading to a more active pawn structure for white in the queen's gambit declined. This move precipitates an exchange of queens, simplifying the position and entering a pawn structure where white will have a central pawn majority, aiming to exploit it in the middle game. By capturing the queen with the king, white enters a simplified endgame, which often favors the side with the more active king and potentially better pawn structure later on. Black recaptures the pawn, developing the bishop to an active square on the diagonal and preparing to castle. Developing the bishop to d3 aims to control the central dark squares and prepare for castling, reinforcing the knight on c3 and creating an active bishop on a good diagonal. This move develops the knight to its natural square, preparing to castle kingside and support the central pawn majority that will emerge on the queenside. This move, b3, prepares to fianchetto the bishop to b2, creating a strong diagonal to control the center and queenside of the board. This move prepares to develop the queenside bishop to an active diagonal and supports the c5 pawn. Developing the bishop to b-flat 2 creates a powerful attacking diagonal aimed at black's queenside and supports the pawn on c5. This move develops the bishop to a very active diagonal, supporting the central pawn and preparing to castle kingside. The king's relocation to e2 is a prudent prophylactic maneuver, clearing the first rank for the rook and preparing for kingside castling, while also avoiding potential tactics on the d-file. This move allows the black king to reach a safer square and prepare to connect the rooks, while also potentially unblocking the e-pawn for future development. This move prepares to expand on the queenside with b4, aiming to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn in the future. The rook moves to the semi-open c-file, aiming to support the pawn advance on c5 and potentially exert pressure on white's queenside. Bringing the rook to the c-file prepares to contest the open file and support the pawn on c5 if white chooses to advance it. The bishop repositions to a more active diagonal, aiming to influence the central squares and potentially support a kingside expansion or pressure white's queenside pawns. This move reinforces the queenside pawn structure and prepares to expand on the queenside, potentially creating a passed pawn or opening lines for the rooks. This pawn push solidifies black's central pawn mass and creates a queenside outpost for the bishop on b7, but it also restricts the mobility of the c-pawn and creates a potential weakness on c6. The move 16. Rhd1 is a centralizing rook move that supports the d-pawn and prepares to contest the d-file for potential activity and pawn breaks. This move prepares to double rooks on the c-file, intensifying pressure on white's c-pawn and creating attacking possibilities along the semi-open file. The knight's retreat to b1 clears the c3 square for a central pawn advance or regrouping, aiming to control the c-file and support piece activity. This move repositions the rook to the c-file, reinforcing control of this open file and preparing for potential pawn breaks or tactical operations on the queenside. This exchange of queens and rooks simplifies the position, aiming to leverage white's more active king and slightly better pawn structure in the ensuing endgame. Black recaptures the rook, aiming to untangle their position and prepare for active piece play by potentially challenging the open c-file. The knight transfers to d2 to potentially support a kingside pawn push with f4 or to redeploy to e4, aiming to control central squares and exert pressure on black's position. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and potentially support a kingside pawn advance. This move prepares to recapture the c-pawn and contests the open c-file for central influence, while also repositioning the rook for potential endgame activity. This move simplifies the position, exchanging rooks and eliminating a potential target on the open c-file for black, allowing white to focus on central control and potentially activating the knight on d2. The recapture of the rook on c1 by the bishop repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to control the d4-h8 diagonal and support central pawn advances. This move aims to develop the central pawn, fighting for space and potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the d4 square. This central pawn push solidifies white's pawn structure and prepares to challenge black's central control, aiming to create an outpost for the knight on d3. The knight repositions to b6 to contest the d5 square and prepare to shift to the kingside, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses created by black's advanced pawns and open files. The move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. The knight's repositioning to h5 aims to control the f4 square and prepare for potential exchanges or advances on the kingside, while also freeing the g6 pawn for further mobility. This move removes a key defender of black's kingside and opens lines for white's pieces. This move simplifies the position by exchanging bishops, which is generally favorable for black as it removes white's active attacking piece and allows the knight to potentially occupy the advantageous d6 square. This recapture of the bishop on e5 is a critical moment, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit the resulting pawn structure where white's knight on d2 is now well placed to pressure black's queenside pawns. This move f6 is a critical pawn break that aims to challenge white's dominant knight on e5 and potentially open lines for black's pieces, although it does weaken the dark squares around the king. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, preparing to contest the d5 square and potentially support pawn advances on the kingside. This tactical check aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, specifically targeting the e4 pawn and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. The king ventures forward to support the central pawn push, aiming to gain space and activate the monarch in the endgame phase. This move is a tactical blunder that loses material, as the knight on g2 is unprotected and will be captured by the white bishop on c1. The king, having been forced from its sheltered starting position, now ventures towards the center to participate in the endgame, aiming to control key squares and support its remaining pieces. This pawn sacrifice is an attempt to create counterplay by activating the knight and threatening to disrupt white's king position. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to support the pawn advance on the kingside and potentially attack black's kingside pawns. After the knight on f4 is dealt with, the king, having been forced out into the open early, now seeks a safer haven by tucking into a more centralized and defensively sound position. This move repositions the white king to a more active central square, aiming to contest control of the e-file and potentially support an advance of the f-pawn. The pawn push, g5 aims to create attacking chances on the kingside by creating space for the knight and potentially opening lines. But it weakens the kingside pawn structure significantly and may prove to be a tactical liability. This move forces the black king into a more exposed central position, creating attacking opportunities for white's remaining pieces, particularly the king and pawns. This pawn move opens the e-file and aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure, but it also weakens the dark squares around black's king. This move, nxg5, capitalizes on the black knight's misplaced position after fxe5, allowing white to win a pawn and disrupt black's kingside pawn structure while centralizing the knight. This move repositions the king to a more active square, intending to support the advance of the e-pawn and potentially participate in the fight for the center. This move sacrifices a bishop to eliminate black's potential passed pawn on g5 and simultaneously opens the h-file for white's king, creating counterplay. This move initiates a desperate attempt to create complications and potentially win material, as white's king is exposed after the sacrifice of the bishop. The king is now actively participating in the game, centralizing to control crucial squares and prepare for potential pawn advances. The sacrifice of the knight on b4 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create tactical complications, forcing white to address the immediate threat while potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces. This move recaptures the pawn but allows black's knight to become extremely active in the center, and threatens further disruption. This move is a tactical blunder, as it allows white to win a pawn by forking the knight on d5 and the pawn on b5 with the bishop on e4. This move repositions the knight to a more active square on the queenside, potentially preparing to support pawn advances or contest squares like c5. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, aiming to support the knight's advance and control the important d5 diagonal while preparing for further central pawn advances. This pawn push supports the knight's advance and prepares to consolidate the queenside, preventing further counterplay for black on that wing. The move 37, b8 is a defensive maneuver to protect the f7 pawn and to prepare to redeploy the bishop to a more active square, potentially g6 or h5, to counter white's king's pawn push and central expansion. This move correctly captures a material advantage, consolidating your strong central pawn majority and preparing to advance it down the board. This recapture of the knight opens a diagonal for white's bishop to potentially attack the black king and also frees up black's queen to support the d-pawn. This move is a critical defensive maneuver to protect the pawn on c4, preventing black from further consolidating their advantage after the material exchange and pawn push. This pawn push is an attempt to gain space on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, but it weakens the pawn chain and allows white to capture it after a series of exchanges. The king is now actively participating in the endgame, seeking central control and preparing to support the knight's advance or protect its own pawns. This move develops the knight to a more central square where it can support advances and potentially attack white's d5 pawn. The king advances aggressively to a central square, aiming to support the passed pawn and exploit the weakness on the queenside. This check forces white's king to move again, allowing black to regroup and potentially develop a new threat on the queenside with the knight. The king is forced to retreat to a more active central position to support the pawns and potentially defend against further checks. White has captured the knight on a3, but the resulting pawn structure leaves white's king exposed and the knight is now deep in enemy territory. This knight move aims to redeploy the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting the advanced pawn or preparing for an attack on the queenside. This move brings the knight to a centralized square, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal towards white's king and potentially create threats against white's scattered pawns. This move re-centralizes the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn on a3 and potentially swing over to support an attack on the kingside or defend the queenside, while also offering counterplay against black's advanced knight on c2. This move forces the white king to an even more exposed position, potentially allowing black to gain material or checkmate material through further activity of the knight and king. This move aims to consolidate the king's position after the exchange of queens and pieces, centralizing it to support the knight and prepare for potential pawn advances or defense against black's active knight. This move forces a king and pawn endgame where white's passed c-pawn will be a decisive advantage, given black's inability to stop it. This move capitalizes on the unprotected knight, winning material and simplifying into a winning endgame with a dominant king. The king, now activated after a long journey, seeks safety on the queenside, aiming to support the remaining pawns and potentially create opposition. This move reorganizes the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn push on the queenside and potentially attack the isolated passed pawn on c7, while also preparing to defend the kingside if necessary. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn by forcing the exchange of white's knight on b3-4, black's knight on d5, simplifying the endgame and centralizing the black king.